everyone, Kevin here from Chaotic Stupid. So because we haven't been able to record any new episodes of Chaotic Stupid recently, I really wanted to do a video about character death. Now, I recently ran a poll on my Twitter account, which I hope you partook in, but otherwise go and check it out because there are some really cool inputs from the community and some incredible ideas around how to handle character death. So whether you like gritty approaches or whether you want the characters to really never die at all, there's something in there for you for sure. So go look at it. It's an incredible source of inspiration. And by the way, thank you to everyone who came out and engaged, commented, voted. I really appreciate all of you. But in this video, I really wanted to talk kind of about my approach, which wasn't very well represented among the answers that I got. There were some people who were kind of on my train, but overall it seemed that the prevalent opinion was that death is a really necessary option to have to make sure that the challenges that the characters face have meaning. Because if a character can never die facing any challenge in the world, the prevailing opinion seems to be that then the danger isn't real, because there's no permanent and final ending that can occur due to failure, bad rolls, bad choices, etc. There's never the ultimate punishment, if you will, for what might happen if you're able to be resurrected at a whim. Now, I don't quite agree, and I will tell you why. But first, I'll tell you my basic premise. My basic premise is, although I don't tell this to my players, not outright, but they know and they experience that their characters will not die unless they choose to allow them to die. This idea is rooted in the larger understanding of how fantasy worlds are typically built. Now, it's true for my world, and I think it's true for many worlds out there, that a D&D world, or a TTRPG world rather, is so much more than just the material plane, right? We have the actual physical world, but there are so many different dimensions and layers to these worlds. We have gods and demons and devils and elementals and powerful beings that live and exist beyond mortal comprehension, perhaps, but they definitely have an influence on the world. And I think that those powers, the powers that be, if you will, provide such an incredible opportunity for us to put agency into the concept of a character dying. Because from the get-go, if we just assume, let's say you're a level 1 character in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, you encounter a bunch of goblins in ambush, and they shoot you down and they kill you. You don't have a choice if that happens. You are delivered to the gods of fate, of dice, and if you go down, you're down. That's it. That's the end of the line. And to me, that has never been a narratively satisfying option, simply because you need to get lucky for your character to die in circumstances that feel satisfying to you. Now, there are many players and many dungeon masters that can feel very satisfied if your character dies in a random ambush, because the characters were taking actions and choices that were in line with who they are, and it just happened to go that way, which is fair. It's just that I don't like the chance that a player would be dissatisfied, even just a little bit, even if they just have one tiny sliver of a thought that they're not happy with their character's death, that they would have liked to see more of them beyond the natural sense of loss, then I'm not happy. So I set up this basic premise: your character does not die unless you choose to allow them to kind of take that concept of agency, of choice, and put it back into death. Because to me, the goal of what we do together as dungeon master and players is to tell a satisfying story together. And the player should have a choice in when that story ends. With death that is subjected purely to dice rolls, I don't believe that you have that choice to a sufficient degree. Now, those are my reasons for thinking about this in the first place, but how do I actually implement it, right? So let's take the story of a character that I had in my first campaign called Kay. Kay was a halfling fiery sorceress who had burnt down half her village when she was young, had escaped, and was now traveling the world, engaged in all sorts of very strange pursuits, mainly to distract herself from the trauma that lay underneath. Now, when Kay died, she went to the underworld, and we joined Kay as her party mourned in the material plane. We joined Kay in the underworld as she got off the boat on the River Styx. She stepped into a city that was there where all the newly departed souls were waiting to be judged by a sort of arbiter of, in my world, the Raven Queen. Now, Kay, before actually being judged in this fashion, came upon her family, the ones that had died as a result of her latent magic expressing itself when she was young, and she was reunited. She had some heartfelt moments, but she also discovered that her brother, who had also died in that fire, was missing. And when she came before the arbiter was very much aware of that, of course, and the arbiter gave her a choice. Essentially, she was told, "You are dead now, but there is a task here that you can complete for which you might be sent back, but you will have to get your brother's soul, which belongs here, which has rested here, back. And you'll have to find out, of course, in the process what happened and why it happened and make sure that it doesn't happen again. And that was my choice for Kay that I presented her with, because I wanted that player who had died in a random combat with a sort of boss monster, but still in a relatively random combat for a side quest. I wanted to give them the option to either continue their character's story or choose to engage in a different one. And this is how I did it, because by providing this choice to Kay, and by the way, she chose to come back, it changed the circumstances of why she was in the material plane. So even though death wasn't made permanent, it still had a permanent impact on the character. And I think that's the difference here, is that you can have a very permanent and a very real impact on a character's journey without cutting it short and having that be the impact. Because to me, the most interesting thing is seeing how characters deal with the circumstances that they encounter. And when a character dies and is let go without a choice, we never see how that character dealt with it. So in my opinion, really, it starts off with, I want to have a glimpse at this character in the beyond. I want to be able to see, okay, how are they dealing? What are their thoughts? Are they trying to claw their way back, or are they finding their peace? And then the player finally gets the last say in whether they actually put their character to rest, or whether that character still has enough reason to come back into the story, even if that return comes at a potentially terrible cost. Because if we take the example of Kay, her terrible cost would be that no matter what she would encounter, she knew that her brother would probably not want to go back, so she would have to force him to come back, or become, quote unquote, evil herself to try to avoid it. And she would have to return with her brother to the underworld. She would only be allowed back for as long as it took her to get him back. And if she strayed, she would be returned to the underworld regardless. So these were the consequences of her choice. It was a stay of execution in a way, which still allowed that character to continue exploring its story instead of having it cut short too soon in a manner where I wouldn't have found it narratively satisfying, and neither would the player, because that's why they chose to have the character return. Now, that's really it in short. I think the key is in using this larger metaphysical space that we have in our D&D and fantasy worlds to provide the characters with more choices in terms of the afterlife. Of course, you're completely free to choose to run a nitty-gritty game in which, resurrection doesn't work, revivify is just a shock to the heart in the hopes that they come back. Put all the DCs on it that you want. You have to adjust your mechanics and your game to what works at your table and what you want to be playing. But I simply want to give an argument for this more narratively focused style of trying to complete the story rather than necessarily having to roll with the punches no matter what they are. So it kind of becomes a question of, to me at least, not a question of, it rather becomes about us as dungeon masters and players together being these guardians of the story that we tell together. And we all have to be happy with that story. And in my opinion, this approach, don't allow a character to die unless the player chooses to allow them to, is a very effective way to make sure that you are never faced with a circumstance in which a player will be unhappy with the cards that they are dealt. Because here's the pitfall that I'm avoiding so much with this. If a character dies in a dissatisfying way, it's immediately one of the worst things that can happen. Because it's not just a mistake, it's not just something that they can crawl back from or something that you can discuss after the game is over and say, okay, we're going to do this next time to smooth it out. I mean, you could, but then you're kind of breaking your own rule, which will also be annoying. If a character dies in a dissatisfying way, you're immediately stuck with that result forever, if that's what you've committed to. And then you just have a really unhappy player. And it goes beyond unhappy player in the sense of, oh, my character just died and I'm sad about it. Everyone can experience that. But if the player is unhappy about the manner in which it happened, that has a chance to fester. And by offering agency on the topic of death, we make sure that that negativity can never take root, because they will always have a choice. And also, the opposite of that, of avoiding this negative impact, is that, in my opinion, having that choice can make the characters who do die permanently all the more impactful as well. Because we know that it's not just something that happened to them, but rather that it's something that they chose, right? And this is the choice of heroes. It's not like every single person who dies in this world has to get this choice. But it's okay for us to acknowledge as dungeon masters and players that our characters are special. They have a special role in the story. They don't need to be layered with plot armor to have that role, but it's still okay to acknowledge it and say, okay, they have slightly different rules governing them, and they will always be governed fairly by those rules, but they are still different from the general general muck that walks about, to be rude for a moment. In any case, that's my take on death, and I hope that perhaps it inspires you. I will definitely also recommend that you go to the Twitter poll and just scroll through the comments. Over 100 people commented. There have been some really interesting discussions and some really cool ideas, no matter what you like, by the way, whether you think my idea is really stupid or whether you think it's a great idea, but there's something in those comments for everyone to be inspired by. And I definitely recommend that you go and look through them, have a chat, talk to the people, ask them more about their ideas, because it's a really interesting topic, and obviously my suggestion is only one of many. But regardless, I hope that I've inspired you to think about this a little more, and please feel free to make any comments that you like, whether you agree or disagree. For the moment, I thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you next time. Bye-bye.